While I was looking at the discussion, we didn't have a colleague from the neuroscience side on the panel. So maybe I want to open it up a little bit more in that direction. What has been talked about up to now is more sort of computing applications kind of a drive, but what would be the desire, what would be the goal from the neuroscience perspective? I see.
I had one question.
Todd, yeah, go ahead.
So having been on the other side of handing out the money a while ago, I'd like to get some feedback from all of you about what advice you would give the people in the government about how to spend the money, manage the projects, set up the projects, and so forth.
Karl-Heinz, do you want to go first since you've been...
Well, I think this is really, I mean, a U.S. question. It's, I don't know. Why don't you start and then I try to give the European perspective? It would be strange if I start, I think.
Go ahead.
Well, not being a program manager, I think part of it is not to get too diffused. You know, it's easy to take money and
I think Mike's on.
Press it again so it lights up. There you go. Try it now.
There.
Okay. I think it'd be valuable not to get too ambitious or too diffuse in the funding. You know, it's in the roundtable we had with the material science and the devices. We could have easily, you know, spent years and millions, you know, doing fundamental basic work. You know, I think part of the challenge is to say, how do you put resources forward that you're going to get you know, a good impact, and you're going to really, you know, address the problem. And I think the second challenge is sort of what's the application. You know, you can build a lot of interesting devices, but what do you know, at the end of the day, what is it that you ultimately want to do with them, and why is neuromorphic the right way to go?
So let me build on Tom's remarks. My concern is that funding in the areas that intersect this room is fairly scattered and somewhat disjointed in the U.S. federal government. So the BRAIN initiative, as you know, is focused on better understanding the brain, which is clearly very important. The Department of Energy will probably have two pots of money, neither of which will quite be critical mass, to do, you know, research and some investigation of the implications for applications and maybe for computing devices, but it won't be large enough. You can certainly imagine IARPA or DARPA taking an interest in this area, but we lack a coherent multi-agency structure for making all these pieces fit together to do something really transformative. And that's a place where I think the Europeans have done a much more interesting job and have really blazed the trail. So there's a nice segue to Karl.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I can make a short comment. We are somewhat in an awkward situation, I think, in neuromorphic computing. Whenever workshops like these take place, everybody says the brain is a great device, energy learning, resilience, and we know all these arguments. And of course, that's true. So what we do as a consequence, we look microscopically to the brain. We know it's made of neurons and synapses and their connections, and we know some of their features. And then we wire up electronics so that it looks like the brain. But we are kind of lacking a strong, I would say, theoretical support for that. I mean, the way out for us, for the European projects at the moment, is to build hardware, which is important, I think. I really very, very much support hardware construction, but it's very, very flexible and very, very configurable, just to be prepared for everything. So if people come up with new theories, new ideas, new plasticity models, things like that, that you can implement them on your hardware infrastructure. And I think we did the right thing in the Human Brain Project to go that way. On the other hand, I more and more believe that we have to invest more in theory, but not just general theory. Often computational neuroscience is called theory. And I don't think that is really theory. It just means you run on a computer what you otherwise run on your neuromorphic hardware. And on a neuromorphic hardware, maybe a bit faster and a bit different features, but there's no fundamental difference. Theory really means that you find the principles of brain computation, which may be wrong or right, coming from theory, but then they can be tested on this machine. So a very close collaboration of theory, and I really mean theory directed to computation on neuromorphic devices, with the hardware construction. That is a very, very important thing. And in the Human Brain Project, we are doing this as part of the activity. To me, that is what should be done, maybe even not only in Europe and the US separated, but maybe even as a joint effort. And workshops like that could be an important contribution.
I have a question for you, Karl-Heinz, but let me phrase it a little first here, just a little background. From my perspective, you know, the European Union got ahead on this, the Human Brain Project, got it going. I think the U.S. sort of followed the Brain Initiative, say, hey, they're doing that, we should do this too. And now there's rumors that China's going to make a big initiative in both, the similar type of initiative going on. But you didn't mention, Karl-Heinz, the changes that occurred in the Human Brain Project in the last year. And it's from our side of the pond, it was, you know, it looks like the whole thing was falling apart. And it's, you know, there's a lot of controversy. And so I just want to get your perspective on that. What did you learn? Is that going to impact these other initiatives? What is the general feeling in the European Union these days about this? Is it like, hey, we just had to tweak the system and now we got it right? Or is it like, oh crap, we really screwed this up and now we're starting over again? You didn't really address that. You know, the controversies that have been following the Human Brain Project in the last couple of years. And,
right.
I think it would be helpful for us to understand your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's a very, very, very difficult question, of course. I mean, it's true, you all know what happened. There was an open letter which was signed by neurobiologists mostly, but also some theorists, I should say, or computational neuroscientists, which didn't like the approach of the project. And there are two levels of criticism, or there were two levels of criticism. One was that people said, you cannot organize work on brain computing like you organize work in astrophysics or particle physics, because these people are not used to work in large consortia or collaborations, but work is being done in little labs, and people make a contribution here and there, and then they go to workshops and they compare the results and then they go home again. But they are not used to work with hundreds or even 500 or 1,000 people just on one project goal. And that is certainly true. I had to learn this because I'm coming originally. I worked 30 years of my life in particle physics. I built one of the data selection systems for the LHC at CERN, where we did exactly that. I mean, there was a scientific goal, and we all focused on that and enabled it by building the right technology. And naively, I thought that would also be possible in brain science. It's difficult. It's far more difficult. But I think we are making progress. The other thing is that people said there is too little neurobiology in the project, in particular cognitive neuroscience. And so as a consequence, what happened now is that cognitive neuroscience is now the biggest part of HBP in terms of funding. So in this sense, the open letter was extremely successful for those who wrote the letter and signed it. Because it's now, if you look, I mean, cognitive neuroscience is far more supported than neuromorphic computing. I personally find that a bit sad, because cognitive neuroscience is an important field. But if you look, I mean, there are thousands of groups in the world doing it, and whether there are now four more groups doing it, which receive a lot of funding, I doubt that has a huge effect on novel computing. Whereas, I mean, just building computers and working on basic theory for neuromorphic computing is not so much supported. And I think it was really a one-time chance to do this in the Human Brain Project. So it has been diluted. I would say, I mean, if I criticize what happened, the scientific efforts have been diluted in the Human Brain Project. I still think it's worth continuing it, but it's not as focused as it was at the beginning. And it will be continued, by the way.
Alice Parker, University of Southern California. I have a very short question that might require a longer answer. Those of us working in neuromorphic computing, especially in specialty electronics, analog electronics, nanotechnology, would like to know what kinds of evidence would we need to present that this is a technology that is indeed useful and working at a level high enough so that the government is happy and says, yes, this is a success, we've gone beyond conventional computing, and now we can drive an autonomous vehicle, we can make a little C. elegans worm, a complete worm with its own neural network. What's the level that we have to accomplish in order to demonstrate success?
Well, I mean, sorry, no, go ahead.
I don't think there's a single answer to that. I think it depends on funders and what they're trying to achieve. The Department of Defense might be interested in autonomous vehicles. Google might be interested in recommendation systems or image analysis. So it depends on who the funding source is. To step back a little bit and ask, I think the more interesting question is scientifically, so forget the funding, but what will the scientific community respond broadly, not people who are already bought into the vision, but what's going to get you an article in Science where people say, wow, this is something really different. To me, the key thing is computational alternatives that are dramatically more efficient in power. And I think that there's a real opportunity for that. To me, that's where the real win is, and that's where I would encourage you to focus your energy.
Just as a side comment, there was an article in Rolling Stone yesterday. I don't know if that counts as a
That's
journal
not quite
paper.
the same as Science, but it's a different audience.
I mean, to me, I must say the most important thing the brain does is to be able to learn from complex data. And at the moment, I don't care how much energy I need for that. Just the capability to perform local learning, I think, is the most important thing, which we haven't really understood, although there are theories coming up. And to me, sort of the killer app or the most important demonstrator would be to show that, for example, you can do a deep learning task, which everybody does now with rather conventional neural networks and brute computing force, like graphic cards or traditional computers, that you can do that, for example, with spiking neurons, not necessarily, but maybe with spiking neurons, and with the capability to perform local learning in the network. Okay, and I mean, we are working on that, and to me, that would be a demonstrator which would be extremely impressive, because we know that local learning, that learning, deep learning provides impressive results. I mean, you know, all this Go fight, which will start in the next couple of days, maybe a machine for the first time will win the Go game against the world champion. But this comes at a very high price at the moment. It's definitely supervised learning, and it requires a lot of time, for example. I mean, probably weeks of learning. And if we can compress that to a short time with little energy and really do it by local algorithms running in the network, to me, that would be finally the neuromorphic computing that is really superior to traditional architectures.
Thank you.
So I think that's about the time we had for the programmatic panel. One thing I'd like to highlight, this is a request for all the speakers that are going to come up as well. This actually relates to the last question. Last year's workshop, we focused on the value proposition for neuromorphic computing. What is it that it will do better than conventional computers? And I think having that theme run through all the presentations and be able to come back during the discussions to sort of seed that discussion and expand upon it would be very helpful. So please keep that in mind during the presentations and also during the Q&A sessions. So with that, I'd like to thank the programmatic panel again.